Sweet. So, yeah, Adam is going to give a presentation. I kind of asked him super last minute. Usually we do like AMA style, but in this case, I'm going to be in the audience for it. But I'm going to introduce him. He is one of the first people that I invested in. He's the first high school dropout that I invested in, but there was a middle school dropout before. But he's the first high school dropout, and the startup he started is called Owner.com. It was when he was 18. He started this business. It was called something else back then. They work with thousands of restaurants. I won't get into revenue numbers. I don't know if I'm allowed to, but he's going to share more about his startup journey, some lessons learned, and feel free to ask him questions as well. But Adam, thank you for doing this, and hopefully we'll give him a round of applause. There's water here as well if you want to.
Awesome, thank you.
Sit down.
So, in true early stage startup fashion, I had zero time to prepare for speaking to, it looks like 40 people here. So, what I thought to myself last night as I was trying to haphazardly prepare is that the way that I could make this most relevant for all of you would be by sharing the lessons that I wish that I had earlier in the journey, because they would have saved me from making all sorts of really painful mistakes, as well as various elements of startups that I've learned along the way. So I'll preface everything I say by, I still have a ton to learn. I'm still super early in my journey myself, but I am speaking to you in the spirit of speaking to like a 4 years younger version of myself, all of the things I would have said to myself to accelerate my understanding of startups and hopefully progress toward our long-term goal. So I'll start by answering a common question that is particularly on the mind of people in this room, which is, why should you start a startup? Because most people here did the Z Fellows program, where you took a week off of school or work and got to hack on something that you were passionate about for all of that time. And the answer is that most people actually shouldn't start a startup, even most people in this room, because it is excruciatingly painful, like in ways that you can't imagine headed in. It is incredibly embarrassing and frustrating and boring for very long junctures. And in general, I think most people, even really smart technical people, would be better served in working in earlier stage startups at first. But the way this brings us to the first massive lesson of startups is that the number one predictor for startup success in all of my friends and the people that I've known that have built startups is actually not intelligence, which is what I thought it would be going in. It's determination. And so if that first statement didn't make you fucking angry inside because you just knew that you were going to be the exception to the rule and prove me wrong as the speaker and saying that you shouldn't start a startup, then it could be a sign that this game isn't for you, because you're going to face massive amounts of self-doubt and of other people doubting you. So it's a nice precursor to start off the bat with determination being by far the biggest predictor of success. And it's not just my observation that this is a massive predictor of success, but if you look at all of the top startup founders in the world, particularly Y Combinator, this is like the top trait that they index for by far, and the thing that they're most trying to suss out. And so, like I mentioned, super painful process and journey, and that brings us to the second massive lesson that I knew earlier, and the second most important character trait in my mind. And I'll preface that by saying that, well, determination is critically important. Of course, you also have to be smart, but at one point, there's like a threshold where after you pass the minimum level of intelligence to be like a unicorn breakout founder, then determination matters a lot more. So intelligence still does matter, but not to the degree that I expected it to. That is trait number 2, shamelessness. It's like one of the most non-obvious ones, but I remember hearing this from a unicorn founder that I was talking to. When I asked him, like, what are the biggest predictors in your mind of startup success, or the traits that you've had to develop? Shamelessness was top of his list. And he's like in his 20s, runs a $10 billion company, like super impressive dude. And the reason shamelessness is so critical is that as a founder, you repeatedly have to put yourself out there in highly uncomfortable situations. Good recent example of this, actually an everyday example for me, is just the extent to which myself and my co-founder over there, Dean, who's been like a absolutely incredible partner on this journey, but the extent to which we persist with candidates when we want them to join our company. After we identify them, we will literally reach out dozens of times before we even hear a response in order to get them to respond back, because we feel such conviction and determination that after we find people with highly relevant backgrounds that could be contributors in our mission, that we're quite relentless in actually recruiting them. And in fact, like half of our executive team now has initially in the process told us that they didn't think it was a fit, that they outright said no. And without that level of shamelessness, where like repeatedly risking potential rejection or embarrassment, they wouldn't have joined the team and made such a trajectory defining impact on our company. So I wish I'd known that earlier, because the thing with shamelessness is that it doesn't mean that I don't feel highly embarrassed when I go out in public and put myself in embarrassing situations, or do the same thing virtually. Either in being massively persistent, or another great example is in selling your product in trade shows. If you sell B2B, it is so uncomfortable to be in a room of thousands of people where you are just repeatedly approaching people and getting rejected, ignored, told off, and then like rinse and repeating every 30 seconds, like trying to pull people to your booth or get to elevator pitch them and get through the process. And while that might be an extreme example that some of you won't ever have to follow, I would say that there's going to be some level of shamelessness that is just outright essential for early stage startup success, particularly as a founder, but even as an early stage team member of a startup. So that brings us to the next insight. Actually, it connects nicely, because I said that this big area where shamelessness manifests is in recruiting. And that was like a massive breakthrough that I think we both had, but I particularly was surprised by, because in the early days of building my startup, I was convinced that the most important thing was great strategy and sound execution toward it. And that if I conceived a clever enough strategy with clear objectives that factored in all the market environment, that I'd be able to build a great company that way, and basically just hire people to fill in the gaps of said strategy. Now, with 5 years of retrospect and 2 years of executing that strategy, I see that it was completely flawed, because while strategy is important, what is far more important for building a startup is actually team. There's a great quote by Vinod Khosla where he says that startups do not become the plan that they make or the strategy that they execute, they become the team that they build. And that is like by far the most true thing I've found so far on this journey. It's that like everything comes down to the quality of people on your team, because as founders, there's no possible way that you could be making every single decision on behalf of your business, particularly as you scale. And unless you have an extremely strong team of people around you that are able to make those decisions on your behalf, then the whole thing is null and void. And so what this specifically looks like I know everybody says like hire A players, and that's not particularly useful advice. But what this particularly looks like is like both my co-founder and I spend a huge portion of our time recruiting, like north of 50% at some points, dozens of hours a week. And beyond just spending a lot of our time recruiting, the profile of people that we recruit that we've found are particularly successful in early stage startups are one of two extreme archetypes that I've identified. On one end, we've got on our team what I would describe as like undiscovered prodigies. These are people like one of our star engineers who will not be named, but who knows who he is, who have been doing cool stuff. Like in this case, he's been coding since he was 4 years old. And now that he's 20, he was actually building a direct competitor to our company when we first got into contact with him. And the competitor had won a hackathon. There were people offering to fund it. And it was like this ridiculous out of a storybook background for joining our early stage company as our first engineer. And long story short, after meeting our team and saying no a few times through the process, he became so convicted in our company because of our determination and persistence and all the progress that he saw that we made, that he decided to shut down the directly competitive startup and join us as our first engineer, and has been extremely productive for years now. And so we've got like that one archetype where we have a team of 50 people, and like a quarter of those 50 people are former founders. Like we have quite a few people that have gone through Y Combinator or raised venture money in some capacity. And those people are particularly useful in an early stage startup environment because they have the mindset that is required to succeed in an early stage startup, where they're instantly taking the owner mentality to, that's what we call it because the company's called Owner, but this like ownership mentality to all the problems that they face, and are extremely resourceful in what they do. And so we pair that extreme, which we try and get as much of as possible, but there's some level of limit to like the amount of people in that bucket because it's quite rare that we're able to scale with. And then the other bucket I would describe as like, if we've got undiscovered prodigies on one end, I would say the other part of our team is industry veterans. People that have years of relevant experience to exactly what that role requires. A good example of this on the leadership level would be our sales leader, Kyle Norton, who has like 10 years of experience building sales teams. Most recently ran sales and success at Shopify, point of sale. So selling to a very similar type of customer that we sell to and building up those teams. And what he brings is all of the insights from that experience of selling to a very similar type of merchant. And it's the two extremes that pair so nicely, because on one end, we've got like the undiscovered prodigies who bring no relevant industry experience and in fact have quite a few naive, crazy ideas, but they aren't bound by industry dogmas. So the innovations that they come up with are next level, and they tend to be harder working and more dedicated on average because they're like fucking crazy prodigy cases. But when you pair that with the other extreme of like these industry veterans and have the team be the combination of the two, then you get all of the practical, relevant industry insights factored into the solutions that are conceived. And it ends up creating a really nice effect where you're simultaneously very innovative and fast moving and hard charging, but you're taking into account everything that you may have learned from, or that they may have learned, various members of your team, from past relevant experiences. So that's like beginning. Oh, I see we've got a question. Perfect. Just as I lose my train of thought. Saving me. What's the question?
Where do you source both types of people?
Where do we source both types of people? So the undiscovered prodigies, I won't tell you all of our secrets, our trade secrets, but the undiscovered prodigies tend to be quite active on Twitter, more so than like LinkedIn. Whereas the industry veterans that are like career talent, like Kyle, are like super active on LinkedIn. So the undiscovered prodigies, you have to like turn over all sorts of virtual rocks to find, like various online forums and GitHub and Twitter, and it's like much harder to get contact details for them because by definition they're like quite peculiar in like their online communication habits. But then fortunately the industry veterans, you know exactly where to find them. You just need to persist until they respond. Yep.
What's the ratio that you would say for undiscovered talent and your prodigies and your industry friends?
At our particular company, it's like, oh yeah, sure. The question was, what's the ratio between the undiscovered prodigy talent and the industry veteran talent? Ideally, if we could just wave a magic wand, we'd skew it like 75 like hard charging early stage startup talent and 25 industry veterans. However, like I said, those people are significantly harder to recruit and more rare. And so we've ended up with a ratio of like 25-75. But the 75% that we have that are more like industry veterans are extremely good. And we specifically in the interview process filtered for high levels of dedication and work ethic, which is actually kind of rare in like a lot of traditional talent. There's a lot of people in 2023 that just don't want to work. like no joke, that are like pretty averse to typical startup work ethic. I actually was canceled last year for saying something along these lines on Twitter. Like literally, I will get myself canceled again and repeat it. I'll tell you guys the whole story and how I got canceled on Twitter last year. So where do I begin with this one? It was a particularly fucking slammed week as a founder. We had all sorts of internal fires brewing and problems to solve. But simultaneously, we needed to scale our team super quickly. And so I had like dozens of interviews scheduled over the course of 3 days, and also had like a million little internal problems to solve. And it was like really, really important that I made use of every minute, which is like the context for the situation. And so our head of talent, Alexis, books me a candidate who has like an amazing industry veteran background. Like he's a top executive at a highly relevant company. He's looking for his next opportunity. So I was super excited to hop on this call. I cleared out time for him. And the way I start every call is doing what I call like a vibe check, where I'm like, hey, how are you? And see if they reciprocate good energy. And so unfortunately, this dude failed the vibe check. He replied, like he actually took 3 seconds before he replied, which is kind of a flag. But then he said, I'm counting down the hours to the weekend. How are you? And I said, well, I appreciate your honesty, but at Owner, we can't have people that are counting down the hours to the weekend because early stage startups are just too hard for that shit. Direct quote. And he then got really upset on the Zoom call. Thank God we weren't in person because I would have gotten punched out with the level of mad this guy was. But he got really upset and he's like, how dare you? I cleared out time on my schedule. How can you be so rude? I dodged a fucking bullet, not working for a tyrant like you. And I said, I appreciate, again, you being transparent and direct, but I don't think this is a fit. And I'd rather just give you the time back because I also need the time to solve some really important problems in the company right now. And so he ends the call and I kind of laugh it off. I actually tell Dean, I call him and I'm like, you would not believe the candidate interview that I just had. It was so efficient. He was ruled out within like 30 seconds. And Dean seemed to think it was hilarious. And so we had an immediate meeting to jump in like 20 minutes after. And so I laughed about it privately for a second. And I'm like, this would be a really funny thing to tweet out. Like the startup people would get it. They would get why this was so funny. And so I tweet out the exact interaction of like, just ended an interview 30 seconds in. Me, hey, how are you? Him, counted down the hours to the weekend. Me, I don't think this is a good culture fit. Sorry. And I post that on Twitter. And then I get into this executive meeting with Dean and a few other people on our team. And we have like a 2-hour agenda. We're powering through setting all of our OKRs. And like halfway through the meeting, I start getting distracted because people are just texting me on my phone like, oh my God, what did you tweet? They're so mad. Or like, bro, I support you, but I can't retweet it. And so I checked my tweet like halfway through this executive meeting and it had over 100,000 impressions in the first like 30 minutes. And so this was like fucking crazy for me. I'm not Twitter famous or anything. I've got a few thousand followers. And so it was like clearly going viral. And at the time, the Twitter UI was such that like I saw a lot of people had retweeted it. And so I'm like, oh, thank God. There's a lot of people that agree with me. They're retweeting it. But I didn't realize that when you tap into the retweets, that like most of them are quote tweets, like people that are like, fuck this guy. This is everything wrong with Silicon Valley encapsulated into one tweet. And so people were like really, really mad. It spread beyond Twitter super fast. I don't know if you guys know this is a thing. I didn't know it was a thing until they were like coming at me with pitchforks. But there's a whole community on Reddit called the anti-work community of like people that are dedicated to eradicating the horrible fruits of capitalism, like hard work. And I was #1 trending on 2 different posts with tens of thousands of upvotes within like another 2 hours on the anti-work community. And everybody was like, this is disgusting. Oh my God, he's a Thiel fellow, Peter Thiel's like ruining this world. And so like all these people were just super mad and like sending death threats. And so eventually I take the tweet down. And then there was like a whole, anyway, point I'm making is like super controversial to say in today's day and age that it requires a extreme work ethic to be successful, particularly in the world of startups. But it blows me away that that is such a controversial idea to people because startups are literally the Olympics of business, if you think about it. They're like a way to compress what would otherwise take decades in like a large company, if even conceivable, into a few years where you're also competing globally with other highly intelligent, hardworking teams of people doing similar things or the same thing in some cases. And so, of course, in order to win in that environment, you have to be absolutely fucking insane in your work ethic. Like super disciplined. But whenever you say that online, the whole mob comes after you because it's an idea that people seem to hate. And it's not just you that has to be like super hardworking. It's like your early stage team also has to have a similar level of work ethic. If you go back and read the biographies of the PayPal mafia, or before that, the Sun Microsystems team, or the Google team, or like any iconic early stage startup, they were all extremely hard charging and hardworking. I can't even name a single exception, and I've read dozens of these biographies of like the most iconic companies of all time. And so unless you think that you are so smart that you can be the exception to the rule and not work like a fucking dog to build a multi-billion-dollar company in a few years, then it's just a reality you're gonna have to confront, and something that I think you should be unapologetic about pursuing, like an ideal that's worth preserving in an early stage company. Okay, what else? Anyone have any other questions? Because I've lost my speaking points at this juncture as well. So if anybody like him can save me, that would be wonderful. Hello.
I was wondering, like, how did you get into the particular industry that you're focusing on? Like, what was, I guess, like, how did you come to this idea of this company?
That's a great question. This is actually one of the things I wanted to cover. Not my particular story, but this concept of founder market fit. So I'm really glad that you asked that question. I'll answer the question, but first I want to lay out the framework that I've noticed in so many of the most successful early stage startups that is worth keeping in mind as you start yours. And the framework is that just like there's product market fit, where you need to iterate the product to meet the needs of the market, there's also this thing, founder market fit. First time I heard the term was from Naval. And the idea is that there is a single best person in the world to build each type of company. And it's typically based on relevant life experiences or backgrounds, or things that uniquely equip an individual to understand the nuances of the market without having to work years in it. And so, like, by and large, the most successful startups have really strong founder market fit, where like the person that's starting it has personal experience with the problem they're facing, or secondhand experience and that they helped somebody overcome it that was personally facing that problem and therefore wanted to solve it. In my particular case, I didn't have personal experience in running a restaurant and facing those problems because I was like a 18-year-old high school dropout at the time and hadn't opened a restaurant at that point. But the founding story was just like a really weird life that I'd had, where I spent my like early teenage years building Minecraft servers and then mobile games. And so I'd gotten quite good at growth marketing. And then I had the opportunity to use that skill set that I built in the gaming world, where it felt like I wasn't making a positive impact, to help my mom, where she had this business that was struggling to attract new customers, and her business was going up in flames before her eyes. She had a few months of cash left, thought she was going to lose the business and potentially lose our house. And I actually built the first version of Owner, or what would become Owner, to save her business. It was this product that powered her website and her appointments for her dog grooming business. And it also had some built-in digital marketing to help her drive more volume, and particularly helped her acquire new customers with SEO. And at first I didn't think much of it. I was just trying to help my mom. But over the course of 6 months, I saw it completely change my mom's life. Where on one end, she was struggling single mom, constantly stressed about potentially losing the business, about acquiring new customers, about not having any effective marketing means, to then giving her a world-class digital presence through applying like that methodology that I'd learned in the gaming world, and seeing over the course of 6 months her transform from that to then this version of herself where she was really excited again about her future and proud of this business that she'd built and hopeful for what was to come. And I realized in seeing the transformation in her that I wanted to build a business around that. I didn't know exactly what it would look like because I didn't know anybody in the tech industry at the time. I didn't have any professional experience beyond building Minecraft servers and games, but I decided I needed to build a business around helping people like my mom achieve their dreams through maximizing their online success, and quickly realized that I wouldn't be able to do it in the exact same industry because there's only a few thousand dog groomers across the entire United States. And I quickly learned about the concept of addressable market and knew that like a few thousand dog groomers was not a sufficient addressable market to build a multi-billion-dollar world-changing business, but that there was this much larger group of people, much like my mom, that needed a lot of the same problems solved, and that was in independent restaurant owners. So repurposed the dog grooming technology to help independent restaurant owners drive more customers and fill up their dining rooms with reservations. And then all sorts of crazy shit happened, including the pandemic, which completely destroyed that plan. And eventually iterated our way into what we're building now. But over the years, I've been at it for 5 years now, and at this particular product for like 2.5. I've built that strong founder market fit and having literally thousands of customer conversations at this point and close personal relationships with dozens of them. Like we're actually just headed back right now from meeting with one of our restaurant partners, and it was the 5th one that I met in person this week. So like that trait of like extreme founder market fit and customer obsession is like just a pattern in every successful B2B company. Not so much in consumer, although it is still relevant in consumer. But particularly in B2B and especially vertical SaaS, like you just have to live, breathe, and eat your customers. Not quite literally, but like really just be on top of every fear that they have and how they view the world and the biggest challenges that they face, because you have to mold your product to meet each of those needs. And it's a super complicated surface area to cover unless you have like a very precise understanding of their lives. Sure, what's up?
What do you think about dropping out of high school and dropping out of college?
Oh, sure, yeah. I'll start repeating the questions from now on, Corey, don't worry. So the question was, what do I think of dropping out of high school and dropping out of college? I have a very slanted point of view, of course, because survivorship bias, but I think that both high school and college are a complete fucking scam. And that unless you're going to Harvard or Stanford or maybe MIT, in which case I think there's like some argument to be made about getting the credential and then dropping out, I wouldn't even recommend going. I know it's a highly controversial take, but I think that the cost-benefit ratio just isn't there, and that they're basically just selling. I don't know if you're familiar with a drop shipping model, but it's this concept in e-commerce where you find like a product that's already got a pretty high propensity to sell, like this shirt, for example, and you just put your logo on it and then like ship it off into the world. I think that's very akin to like the university model where they filter for all of these people that have already demonstrated great work ethic and strong innate intelligence, and they stamp their logo on them and then ship them off into the world and then take credit for all of their success. Like this idea that Bill Gates wouldn't have started Microsoft or Mark Zuckerberg wouldn't have started Facebook without Harvard, I think is particularly laughable in 2023. I suppose Facebook itself, which literally started as a social network for college students, might be a counterexample. So have to be intellectually honest about that one. But all the rest, Microsoft, like Bill Gates and Paul Allen had already started Trafodata prior to Harvard. And in fact, they left Harvard quite quickly in that journey to move to New Mexico and sell the first versions of the Microsoft product to the Altair manufacturers. This leads me to a really interesting train of thought, which is how critical it is to study past successes. Like, as you can see, I have a pretty encyclopedic knowledge of all of the most successful startups over the last 40 years. And the reason I started studying past successes and biographies of the most successful founders is I noticed that Patrick Collison does it. Like on his personal website, he has all of these biographies where he deeply understands the history of Silicon Valley and each successful company that's worked before. And the big insight there is that patterns persist. And that if you can identify a pattern that has worked well repeatedly for various companies in the past, then you can replicate said pattern in your company in order to increase your own propensity for success. So I highly recommend reading voraciously, but particularly reading biographies of past successful founders or general entrepreneurs. Of course, a lot of the principles carry, because it is a huge hack and superpower. Yep, what's up?
Top 3 books in that vein that you recommend?
Particularly business biographies?
Yeah. Or success stories of startups. Those books you mentioned.
Okay, there's one biography actually on Bill Gates called Overdrive that's quite strong. There's one that isn't a startup founder, but just an iconic entrepreneur, Made in America, autobiography of Sam Walton. That really redefines what it means to be a customer-centric founder. And Sam Walton also, founder of Walmart, by the way, would have been the richest man in the world by far had he not distributed his money across all of his family. Super successful and smart entrepreneur. I separate the term founder for particularly technology startup people and entrepreneur for the rest. by the way. If I were to take a number 3, I think Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson would be number 3, as like a product obsessed founder. I think there were more questions from that general zone. Yeah, what's up?
You mentioned a blog before with biographies from Silicon Valley and so forth. You mentioned an offer. What was the name? Patrick something?
Oh, Patrick Collison is the co-founder of Stripe, and he has a personal blog where he details like the favorites of the thousands of books that he's read, and like a great portion of them disproportionately are these biography type books. But like even OG ones from companies that aren't a part of the everyday vernacular today, like the IBM founders and Sun Microsystems and various other like really important historical stories from 40, 50, 60 years ago that actually have a ton of relevant insights. Yep.
Can you talk more about pivoting after the pandemic? Like what the struggles were, how, like, what were the really crucial decisions you got right? What went into the thought process there?
So the question is, can I talk about pivoting after the pandemic? What were the struggles and thought processes during that period? So, like I mentioned earlier, going into the pandemic, we were selling software that helped restaurants drive in-store traffic and reservations. And the reason we specialized in in-store traffic, in other words, customers visiting their dining rooms and reservations, was because they would always tell us, Adam, don't drive me online orders. Online orders totally fucking suck for us because we lose 30% on each transaction to DoorDash and Uber Eats. We lose all the customer data. We think it's a subpar experience to dining within our restaurant where we can provide a deeper sense of hospitality. Just drive in-store traffic. And so like the whole company was built around that, using SEO and helping them SEO optimize their websites by default. It was also bootstrapped for the first like 2 years. And so we were actually profitable because I didn't think anybody would fund a high school dropout until this crazy guy I met, Corey Levy, was willing to do it. But anyway, back to the story. Headed into the pandemic, we'd just signed more PF Chang's locations. So we were actually super excited going into 2020. We were working with all these independent restaurants and PF Chang's and generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash flow. We were profitable. And then March of 2020 rolled around, and suddenly our product, which was focused on in-store traffic and reservations, became completely fucking irrelevant to the entire market. So the customers that we just spent 2.5 years acquiring and building relationships with and building product for, over the course of 2 weeks, like all ditched us. Like, I'm sorry, we can't pay for this software anymore because our dining rooms are closed. We're looking at bankruptcy ourselves. Like, we are happy to resume as soon as this is all over, but we can't continue. And so that was really shitty because that was like a huge portion of our funding at the time. We had like 2 investors, Corey and this other guy, who had like met us along the journey and offered us money, but quite scary. And at that point, at first it was horribly depressing because like 2.5 years of progress being wiped out in 2 weeks, with like also being about to run out of money. I thought I'd have to move back in with my mom. Like, all these things are going horribly wrong. And so after like a week of feeling sorry for myself, or maybe a few days, I realized that like, while our product market fit had been reset and that could have killed us, so had literally everybody else's, including our customers. And so I realized that like, what better position to be in than having fucking nothing to lose, being about to be on the verge of bankruptcy myself, where I could just reach out and better understand the needs of our market and then adapt to those needs. So started talking to not only all of our previous customers, but then also cold calling hundreds of restaurant owners. Like, hey, my name is Adam. I'm an 18-year-old high school dropout. I have literally nothing to sell you. I just want to know, how can I help you during this time? What are the biggest challenges you're facing? And over the course of hundreds of conversations, I kept distilling down these 3 common massive problems where they hated the online ordering systems like DoorDash and Uber Eats and Postmates and Grubhub, which had become their entire businesses during this period. And the reason they hated them was they took massive 30% fees in this industry where profit margins average 5%, and they took all of the restaurant's customer data, so they didn't even know their customers' names anymore. Not to mention their email addresses or phone numbers to be able to build those relationships and promote specials to them. So like, horrible lose-lose proposition to the restaurants. And so as a last resort, Hail Mary, to hopefully save our business, we hacked together the solution to that problem. It was this really shitty MVP that like just kind of perfectly touched upon each of their needs, like wrapped them like a glove, a very thin glove. But we launched that thing into market in May, about to run out of cash, and then thank God it fucking took off. Like, we struck the head pin of demand at exactly the right angle, and the market was just reverberating with demand. And so we quickly, over the course of 10 months, went from like about to run out of money, 0 customers, about to like be a horrible situation, to then 10 months later, thousands of customers, millions in revenue, over $10 million in venture capital raised from some of the most famous investors in Silicon Valley. And at that point, we had this new breath of life breathed into the business, including one of my very close friends who had years of experience in building for restaurants, and who, back when I had met him, like, it occurred to us that we had to work together at some point, but we didn't know like exactly when the right time would be, because we were each building very distinct startups, and I was pretty set on being a solo founder. That person, as we were like just starting to take off in terms of growth, solved a really important problem for us, because while we were growing super fast and like the demand was there for the problem we were solving, because we were uniquely doing it, like our product was fucking terrible. The state that I could get it to was truly dreadful. It was like 70% uptime, meaning 30% downtime, like losing customer data left and right, just a horrible experience that people were somehow tolerating because they like kind of needed it to survive. So they were clinging on like a life raft with holes in it. And so luckily this old friend that I'd had was open to partnering up and joining me as co-founder to lead technology and engineering at the time that we needed it most. So simultaneously, while all this crazy shit was happening, we were about to run out of money and then we weren't, I ended up making one of the best decisions I've ever made in partnering up with Dean over there. And he took our product from being like really shit to fucking world-class really fast. And on the back of that like massive improvement in product itself, we saw great retention and all these other really encouraging metrics that then have since allowed us to scale. Corey said, time for 2 more questions. Yes.
I would have gone back to recruiting. Like in the beginning, you said like we're really obsessed like getting talents. We like identify them and like contact them 12 times, even if they don't reply. Like, I don't know. That seems a bit unintuitive for me. Like if they don't reply at reaching out again. Can you maybe elaborate on that?
Sure. So the reason I built the stalker muscle. Oh, sure. Yeah. Sorry. I really need to get the hang of this. The question was, in recruiting, you said earlier that you reached out to candidates like 12 times in order to get them to reply. And that seems unintuitive. Like, seems kind of rude and intrusive and stalker-like. And so, like, why do you do that? How do you do that? How do you mentally get around it? And like, how do you think about it? It's a great question. It also seems unintuitive to me. And it's super uncomfortable to do often. But I actually took like an outbound sales mentality, which I had to learn somewhere along the journey to acquire restaurants, and then started applying it there and noticed it was super effective. So for context on outbound sales, there's this really interesting statistic that I read from HubSpot that totally changed my life when I started living by it, which is that most sales, when somebody's selling a product outbound, happen after touch point 7. In other words, it takes 7 times that the salesperson calls you before, on average, somebody buys. And what's so interesting about that is that some people buy on time 1, which would execute the average down, but it means that there are some sales that take place that are literally after time 15 in order to bring the average back up. And so after reading that statistic and realizing just how much persistence it requires, I started doing that in outbound sales, and I started noticing better and better results that like fucking harassing people would work. The truth of the matter of why it works is that we live in a super noisy world where like people are constantly being bombarded with messaging from all sources. And the only way to break through the noise in this noisy world is to be super loud and bold. And when you have enough conviction in a product, in this case, you're selling the product that is your company, to hammer people until they reply, because you know that replying to you will be a great decision for them. You have that internal conviction, then it becomes psychologically easier. It's still highly uncomfortable and embarrassing, hence why I said at the beginning, shamelessness was a pretty necessary trait to being an effective founder. But it works in outbound sales, and then when we started applying it to recruiting, it started working super well. Like I mentioned earlier, like half of our executive team, so more than half, 3 of the 5 people actually said, no, I'm not interested to me, multiple times in the process of recruiting them, the people that like now run our company. And now after like years of experience in working together, or a year in like some cases, they're thrilled. They think it's one of the best decisions that they've ever made, but they wouldn't have made that decision had I not had the conviction to help them see why it was in their best interest. Hey, what's up?
So I've got a question. You mentioned at the start that like most people shouldn't start companies. I was curious as to like, do you think that you just like know when you should do it? And like you mentioned, like they should go and work for a company, for instance. Do you think that like people just know like when the right time is, or like there's a right idea, or sometimes it's just like you're gonna have to try it and see what happens? Like, could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. Question was, you mentioned at the top of the presentation that most people probably shouldn't start a startup because it's such a difficult journey. There's often no founder market fit, and so it's kind of a forced endeavor. And there's all these other problems that come from forcing yourself to start a startup. So what should people do instead, or how should they think about that? The answer to this question is, I stand by what I said at the top, but there's also great value in developing a really strong network of people that when you are ready to start a startup, you have within reaching distance to join you on that company. I got super lucky, or maybe I was just like way too unreasonably like fucking determined, because there were so many moments in which I really, really wanted to give up, or like could have given up, that I didn't. And I think that would have been significantly easier if I had a really strong founding team around me from the beginning. Like ever since Dean and I partnered up, I've never felt that way for half a second. But along the way, when we lost all of our customers and we're about to go bankrupt, like there's a thought that crosses your mind that like maybe life would be easier if I just went down the fucking traditional path like everybody else that I know, and had listened to the people who told me it was the worst decision of my life to drop out of high school and head down this very unconventional path. In terms of specific examples, I actually studied this because I wrote a blog on my website, a blog post about joining a startup. There's all sorts of really, really successful people in Silicon Valley that you wouldn't expect that actually started at other startups as part of their founding teams and then went on to join the startups that then made their career, or start the startups that made their career. Like Brian Armstrong, for example, co-founder and CEO of Coinbase, was one of the founding team members of Airbnb. Little known trivia fact of Silicon Valley. There's a few other examples. David Sachs was founding VP of operations at PayPal, but he wasn't a founder. And then he went on to found Yammer, which sold for over $1 billion to Microsoft. Marissa Mayer was founding team of Yahoo, but wasn't a founder. And then wasn't a founder of Google, but like joined so early that she ended up becoming a major executive there and making her career there. Eventually, making billions of dollars on Google. So point is that like quite a lot of success stories in Silicon Valley are people that are around really promising early stage startups where they synthesize that environment and build their network and give themselves, like fertilizing a plant, like the right environment through which to have great growth in starting their own company when they're ready. But like I said, I have serious survivorship bias and a super weird journey. And so like I probably wouldn't have given myself the same advice, because there was probably no startup that would have hired me when I was starting. Like I had zero credentials, zero network. Like I don't know what I would have been useful for, maybe like an early growth hire, but I thought my only option was to start a startup.
Any closing remarks?
Closing remarks. Let me check my phone notes where I wrote out the things that I wanted to say to see if there was anything that I left out. Okay, so there's like 2 points that I'll condense into one. And that first point, actually, I'll do them in reverse order. Like, starting a startup is super hard, but it's significantly easier if you have the ability to discipline yourself and police yourself, because nobody else is going to be your parent and like tell you what to do, when to do it at all. You just have like completely free days that you make up. And surprisingly, most people in those environments like don't actually become super disciplined and execute relentlessly. They often just take the time and like pursue things in a more relaxed manner, or with not enough urgency. And so the point I'm trying to make is that like discipline is a fucking superpower in starting a startup. It is so, so important. So in terms of like our typical day, or I'll just go through my typical day. When I'm in grind mode, I just got back from like traveling a bunch, which was a fucking crazy experience in and of itself, because I had to be up much later than I usually am. But typically I wake up 5 a.m., Shortly after waking up, I do 2 hours of deep work, 5 to 7 a.m. Then 7 a.m., I'm in the gym. I get a workout in. I'm usually back by 8:30. 8:30 a.m. to noon, I do another 3.5 hours of deep work. Then noon to 4 p.m., I do all of my calls on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, sometimes Friday. And then like 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. more deep work, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. read, rinse and repeat, like 7 days a week. I take no weekends. I don't take holidays. This year I made an exception and like took a few hours for Christmas dinner, but super disciplined and hardworking. And I'm not trying to like toot my own horn or say that I'm like the greatest founder that you should model or anything along those lines. But the reason I do it is that I've met founders that are smarter than I am, like by a significant measure. Like Sam Altman is just fucking genius, absolutely brilliant. And yet he doesn't rest on those laurels. He works like a fucking dog. Like it is crazy being around him because he's just like constantly tunnel visioned and super hardworking and also has all these other amazing qualities. And so if he can't rest on those laurels in order to build a multi-billion-dollar company and he has to be super hardworking, like I need to work even harder because I've made this promise to myself that I will not be outworked. Like I will be beaten in other dimensions of my life just naturally. But as far as what I can control, my work ethic, like that is something that I need to preserve as a competitive advantage to survive. And so I treat my life that way. And the point I'm trying to make or merge in is that as a founder, regardless of what your title is, your function, particularly in the early days, is not to like look cool and talk to the press and like hype people up about your company. It's ultimately to be the chief accountability officer of your company. Like that is the real title of any founder. It's like setting a really high standard and then holding people to executing to that standard. And the first person you have to hold to a really high standard in order to be effective is yourself. So that's where discipline comes back in. All right, that's the end. Fiend.
Adam, thank you for doing that. This was super last minute, and we were originally going to do an AMA, so great job presenting. I think Dean, by the way, say hi to everyone. Dean and Adam are probably going to stick around for a little bit, so if y'all want to hang out and meet them more one-on-one, they will be around for just a little bit longer. And yeah, there's drinks and food over there. Adam, thanks again.
Thank you.